And there were others outside of politics who were very engaged with island issues and island problems at various stages. There is a gallery of inspiring and infuriating priestly rogues that I encountered in writing this book, and they became so important to the story of the islands that I devoted a separate chapter to them. Champions, priestly champions of the islands. Some who, it seems to me, were sent to island communities as a form of punishment, but then had the zeal of the convert and became great champions of the islanders. You can see this with Father Michael O'Donoghue in the 1880s, who sent a famous telegram to central government saying, "Send us boats or send us coffins." And that agitation was effective because £20,000 was supplied for a new harbour. There was also Father James O'Donnell on Tory Island, who was very good at using journalists in the 1880s and the 1890s to highlight the plight of Tory Island. And they were looking for donations and money for nets and improvement to the harbour. And the novelty of using the media, using the press at that time. There was an awareness that the best and most effective way to get your message out and your complaints out were through contacts with journalists who could write stories about the islanders. Another very interesting character in relation to the islands was Father Murtagh Ferriter, who administered to the Aran Islands in the late 19th and the early 20th century. He frequently referred to my islanders in his correspondence with the Catholic Archbishop of Tuam. And he suggested in 1919 that my islanders are not lacking in either brain or muscle and are only awaiting an opportunity of exercising both. He was disgusted with the red tape that he regarded as stymieing a lot of the projects that he had for the island. At a later stage, there were other priests who disarmed the myths of Irish independence with a caustic language, including Father Padraig Staunton, who was administering to Inisheer in 1974. And he suggested that the church muzzled anything in a dog collar that pissed on the sacred cows of church and state. And priests could often get very annoyed at their own church when it came to the failure to champion the welfare of the islanders as they saw it. So certainly you have many of those champions. Another one was Diarmaid O'Péician in the early 1980s, who after retirement went out to Tory Island and again became a great champion of the island, to the extent that he accused Donegal County Council of genocide when it came to its plans to resettle the Tory Islanders on the mainland. And he also accused the County Council of forgetting the primacy of the spirit of the island population. And he certainly achieved a lot in the 1980s before he himself was booted off the island because he was causing so much trouble that his bishop decided enough is enough. But the story of the island priests is not just one of benevolence. It's quite clear that some of them are capable of abusing their power and their authority. Father Murtagh Ferriter did an awful lot to promote the welfare of the Aran Islanders, but he was also a violent bully and a tyrant. He found himself at the centre of a number of different legal disputes, including in 1908 when there was a very high-profile trial of Roger Duran, who had been the bailiff to the Digby estate that owns the Aran Islands. And he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for bombing the house of Father Murtagh Ferriter as a result of a dispute over land. And the judge that was presiding suggested if it had been in his power, he would have given a much stiffer prison sentence. And what he said was very revealing, the judge. Priests in rough communities like the Aran Islands are not to be too hardly judged if they take the law into their own hands now and again. So there was license to Father Murtagh Ferriter to do whatever he liked. He wasn't in the house at the time of the bomb. But a couple of years later, he was at the centre of another very controversial trial when David O'Callaghan, who was a priest and a Gaelic League enthusiast, a teacher and a Gaelic League enthusiast at the Oakwater School on Inishmore, was denounced from the altar by Father Murtagh Ferriter. The two had clashed about various things, including his attitude to religion. And David O'Callaghan subsequently sued Father Murtagh Ferriter for slander and eventually lost the case in 1911 and had to leave the island because, of course, Father Murtagh Ferriter went after the damages. And during all of these trials, a lot of information comes to light about the way in which Father Murtagh Ferriter could inspire both terror and adulation on the island, and he really did divide the islanders. There were victory bonfires when he came back after his victorious trials in Kilronan, and yet you also had those who were loyal to the memory of Roger Duran. They named themselves Lucht on Tin Can, the Tin Can Party, after the tin can in which the homemade explosive was mixed that went into the house of Father Murtagh Ferriter. And one of those members of the Tin Can Party was Nemo Flaherty, a native of the Aran Islands who went on to write brilliantly about these controversies in the novel Excerpt in 1932, which really dramatises this story and this battle between the priest and the school teacher. And the way Brendan O'Hare, another native of the Aran Islanders, summed it up, the experiences of the priest and the people of Ferriter and the population suggested that those who could not be bought over had to be silenced, isolated, or broken. And that's a very bleak summation, but quite an accurate one, I think, in relation to Father Murtagh Ferriter and the Aran Islanders. There were also priests who did want to be taken off the islands at various stages. Father Martin O'Donnell, for example, was on Inishmore in the 1930s as a curate, and he wrote to Dr. Gilmartin, the Catholic Archbishop of Tuam, suggesting there were 10 houses engaged in this accursed poaching traffic on Inishmore, and he had found 2 sons of the national teacher drunk on the island. One of them was only 12 years of age. And he went on to say, "Should your grace deem it necessary to change me from this posting, I only ask that I not be put next nor near a poaching district." But priests, of course, could also become remarkably cherished by the islanders, including Father Duggan, who was on Tory Island in 1942, and he refused to leave the island when he was ordered to do so by his archbishop. This became such a heated row that the papal nuncio got involved in 1942. And the individual who was to replace Father Duggan arrived out to the island. He was, according to a letter he subsequently wrote to the bishop, he was twice prevented by physical force from leaving the spot where he had stepped ashore. No priest for them but Father Duggan. And he had to turn on his heels and get back into the boat through the raging seas back to the mainland. You also then had Father James McDyer, who went on to find fame later on in Glencolmkill as the great priest cooperative organiser trying to bring industry and tourism and self-sufficiency to that part of Donegal. It's not as well known that he also spent some unhappy years on Tory Island. He felt it was a waste of his youth. Some of the best years of my life were frittered away on Tory Island. He found it very frustrating, though he did observe that the minds and the deftness of the islanders were honed to a remarkable degree. But he himself found it quite frustrating. There was also then contrasting assertions as to the relationship between priests and the island population. Robin Fox was a very interesting sociologist who spent some time on Tory Island in the late 50s and the early 1960s. He suggested that priests sit lightly among them. And I think that's true of a lot of the islands. They could compartmentalise. Priests were useful for a lot of things, but they could also be ignored when the islanders deemed it necessary to ignore them. Other priests were very active in relation to the bringing of infrastructure to the islands. Consider the saga over electrification, rural electrification. Father Godfrey in Achill Island was very involved in that campaign in the 40s and the 50s. You had Father James Enright on Valentia Island, who was one of the leading lights in demanding that a bridge be built between mainland and Valentia Island. Eventually was in 1970 at a cost of $500,000. And then the irascible Father Tomás O'Murchu on Cape Clear, another great advocate of the Irish language and the scourge of officialdom when it came to their failure, as he saw, to support